I'm coming down now. There was an abandoned house sitting in the middle of a fancy neighborhood in Calgary that nobody would go near. And I mean nobody. Now, my pal Albert was the agent in charge of selling that haunted house, and he tried everything in his power to close a deal. But folks were too plumb scared to make an offer, even at rock-bottom prices. Finally, Albert lit on the notion of selling the house sight unseen to a rich city slicker from the States. Worked like a charm, too, until the day the city slicker decided he wanted to visit the property after all. Albert was all set to take the fellow there at high noon, but the city slicker's train was delayed, so it wasn't until after dinner that the two men set off for the haunted house. It was a dark and rainy night, but early enough in the evening that the ghost might still be resting. At least, Albert hoped this was the case. Albert unlocked the front door, and it opened with an ominous creak. Albert swallowed nervously, but the city slicker just chuckled and said something about atmosphere. Albert relaxed a bit and wondered if he shouldn't have raised the price a bit. The two men entered a tall foyer absolutely festooned with dusty cobwebs. "Creepy," the city slicker said enthusiastically. He bounded energetically into the center of the foyer. "Come to me, foul spirits," he intoned loudly. Immediately, the whole house rang with a sinister, unearthly chuckle. Then an unearthly voice boomed, "I'm coming down now." The city slicker jumped and then turned to Albert with a happy grin. "Great special effects. How'd you do that?" "I didn't," Albert said, his teeth chattering. He backed up until he hit the front door and stood there with his hand on the knob. "I'm coming down now," the voice boomed again, and the city slicker's grin slipped a bit. He looked at Albert's frightened posture and then followed the agent's gaze toward the stairs. A bright light exploded into being at the top of the steps and quickly resolved into a sinister green head with flaming eyes, writhing hair, and fangs instead of teeth. The head opened its mouth and screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound that scraped across the nerves. As the head began rolling down the stairs toward the two men, Albert's nerve broke, and a moment later he was halfway down the road, his own scream rivaling that of the specter in the house behind him. It wasn't until he was almost home that he realized that he had company. The city slicker was running along beside him. "Mister, I don't think I want that house after all," he panted. "Why not?" asked a hauntingly familiar voice. Albert and the city slicker looked over and saw the green head with flaming red eyes keeping pace with them as they raced down the street. The city slicker gave a screech that would have shamed a banshee and disappeared into the distance so fast there was no keeping up with him. "Must have been the asking price," the floating head said conversationally to Albert. The real estate agent shrieked even louder than the city slicker and ran away so fast that his shoes made sparks against the pavement. The next day, Albert quit his job and moved to Vancouver, where he spent the rest of his life working on a fishing boat. And the haunted house fell into ruin and was eventually torn down. Invisible hands. A couple of Welsh miners came to Nevada to help mine the Comstock lode. They were quite a pair of tricksters, yes sir. It got so bad that no one would believe anything they said, because if and they did, the Welshmen would make them look like a fool. But they were popular. The miners dearly loved a laugh after a hard day working in the mine. Now one evening the two Welshmen started down the stope of the Baltimore shaft. They were working a late shift, and as they descended they began hearing the sound of hammers striking a drill, punctuated with the sound of voices. Neither man recognized the voices, so they assumed it was some new chaps working the late shift. The men grinned at each other. They liked pulling jokes on newcomers. The Welshmen followed the sound of the hammers and came into a shaft flickering with the light of a single lantern. The Welshmen were amazed to see two hammers floating in midair, striking the head of a rusty old drill that was rotating itself. They could hear a murmur of voices, but could see no one. Giving a startled yell, the Welshmen beat a hasty retreat. Climbing to the top of the mine, they gasped out the story to a few of their friends. No one would believe them. It was just the sort of practical joke the men had learned to avoid. Finally, the Welshmen grabbed two of their fellows and dragged them, protesting, down the stope. When the four men entered the shaft, the invisible hands were still hard at work, hammering at the drill as they talked to each other. "It's the Booka," shouted old Ned, who hailed from Cornwall, England. The Booka, Tommy knockers, were small imps or spirits who haunted mines. "I'm getting out of here." The miners ran out of the shaft and hurried up into the starlight. The Welshmen were not so quick to play jokes on their friends after this incident, and they stopped investigating mysterious noises. Jack-o'-lantern. After a long day of unlucky hunting, I found myself stuck in the middle of the marshlands for the night, without a flashlight or a lantern to guide my stumbling steps. So I settled beside a fallen log to rest until daylight. As I tossed and turned, I recalled the story my great-uncle told me about a ghost that haunted the marshlands. There was once a man named Jack who was a nasty fellow. He beat his wife and kids and was an all-around bad chap. Jack got worse and worse as the years rolled by. But finally Jack's body got so wore out that he died. He went up to heaven, but St. Peter refused to let such a wretched fellow in. Then he went to hell, but the devil barred the door as soon as he saw Jack coming and wouldn't let him in either. "Go away and don't come back," the devil told Jack. "How am I supposed to get back in the dark?" Jack grumbled. "Give me a lantern." So the devil threw a chunk of molten fire out to Jack, who took it for his lantern and went back to Earth, where he wanders forever through the swamps and marshlands of the earth, a bitter spirit whose only delight was in luring the unwary to their doom with his lamp. At this juncture in my musings, I happened to look out over the marshes and noticed a blinking light in the fog. "Is that you, Jack-o'-lantern?" I called jovially. "Jack, Jack, Jack," a voice whispered back. I was seriously spooked. I clutched my gun to my chest, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Had that been an echo of my voice, or was someone out here with me? "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave and menacing. I waved my gun around. "Show yourself at once." "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed from a completely different section of the swamp. A light blinked on and then off. On and then off. Shudders ran up my spine at the sound of that ghastly voice coming from nowhere. I huddled up against the log, wanting something firm at my back. Suddenly, the story of the jack-o'-lantern didn't seem so funny. My heart was pounding so hard it made my chest hurt. I strained my ears in the silence that fell over the swamp. "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed from somewhere to my left this time. The light blinked on, off, on. I counted 10 heartbeats this time before it went off. The voice sounded closer. I held very still, my instinct screaming at me to hold my breath and not move until the menace had passed. The voice came again, far off to the right. "Jack, Jack, Jack," it hissed. The light came on, off, off. "It's moving away," I thought, relaxing just a bit. Feeling safer. There was a long silence. Nothing stirred, not the wind in the grass, not the frogs or turtles in the water, not the crickets or night insects. "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed softly, right into my ear. And I looked up into the glowing red eyes and twisted face of the jack-o'-lantern. I screamed and lashed out at it with my gun. I ran a few steps, tripped and fell over, knocking my head on a sharp stone. For a moment I saw stars, and I felt blood pouring from my scalp. But the jack-o'-lantern was right behind me. I had to get away. I rolled and fell into a deep pool. I plunged underneath the water, flailing desperately against rope-like grasses that tried to keep me down. My head finally burst out of the water, and I gasped desperately for air, treading water as best I could with my trembling limbs and aching head. I heard the creature laugh in the mist. "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed delightedly, and the light blinked on, off, on right over my head, blinding my dazed eyes as horror flowed through me and froze my limbs so I could no longer swim. For a long moment, the grotesque face and red eyes of the jack-o'-lantern loomed out of the mist before my petrified gaze. My head started to swim with pain from my bleeding skull. The evil face above me, lit by its bright light, whirled around and around, growing dimmer as my eyes started to glaze. I was vaguely aware that I should keep swimming, keep trying to make my way to the edge of the pool, but the effort was too much for my suddenly heavy limbs. I barely noticed myself plunging down and down into the watery depths of the pool, too stunned by my injury to find my way to the surface a second time. Then there was only darkness and silence and a voice hissing in cold triumph, "Jack, Jack, Jack." Jack and the devil. Jack was a nasty fellow who beat his wife and kids and was an all-around bad chap. So the devil came and hauled the poor fellow away with him. On their way to hell, Jack asked the devil if he was thirsty, and old Lucifer said he was. So Jack somehow persuaded the devil to turn himself into a coin so Jack could buy them both a drink from a handy tavern. Only Jack stuffed the devil into his coin purse, which had a cross on it, and wouldn't let the devil out until he agreed to give Jack another 12 months of living. The devil didn't have much choice in the matter unless he wanted to live forever in a coin purse, so he agreed and Jack let him out. Jack went back to his wicked ways, figuring he'd repent and get religion during the second half of his stolen year, and that would be good enough to keep the devil away. Only Jack kept putting off the time when he'd change his ways until one day he opened the door and found the devil on his threshold. Away went Jack and the devil, going down to hell. When they passed a great big tree full of apples, Jack asked the devil if they could get some of the fruit for a snack to eat on their way to perdition. The devil agreed, so Jack gave the devil a lift into the branches so he could pick them some fruit. Once the devil was up the tree, Jack whipped out his jackknife and carved a cross in the bark so that he couldn't come down. "Let me down," shouted the devil, but Jack wouldn't let him down until the devil promised to never come after him no more. Then Jack rubbed out the cross carved into the bark until you couldn't see it, and the devil was free. The devil stomped off without another word, and Jack could do as he pleased from then on. Well, Jack got worse and worse as the years rolled by. But all good things come to an end, and Jack's body got so wore out that he died. Jack's spirit went straight to the pearly gates, but St. Peter refused to let such a wretched fellow into heaven, so Jack was forced to go down to hell. But the devil barred the door as soon as he saw Jack coming and wouldn't let him into hell either. "Go away and don't come back," the devil told Jack. "Go back where you came from." "How am I supposed to get back in the dark?" Jack grumbled. "Give me a lantern." The devil threw a chunk of molten fire out to Jack, who took it for his lantern and went back to Earth, where he wanders forever through the swamp and marshlands of Earth, a bitter spirit whose only delight is in luring the unwary to their doom with his light. Joaquin Maria, bandit of the goldfields. Joaquin Maria and wife Rosita lived with his older brother Carlos in California. The three Mexican immigrants were living on a small, successful farm, and the men were also working a claim near Hangtown. However, the other miners living nearby tried to run them off, telling them that it was illegal for Mexicans to pan for gold or hold a claim. The Murrieta brothers ignored their threats and continued to live peacefully on their farm and work in the gold fields. Enraged by this flagrant disregard for the American laws, a drunken mob attacked the little family late one night, shooting Carlos and then ravishing and murdering Rosita while Joaquin was forced to watch. The mob bound the Mexican to a stake in the yard, where they beat him with a whip. He strained angrily against his bonds, but finally his wounds overcame him and he slumped senseless against the post. The mob left him for dead, but when a few sober citizens came the next day to help the Mexican family, Joaquin was already gone. A few months later, a dark-bearded, long-haired stranger with cold black eyes set up a gambling establishment in Hangtown. Shortly after the stranger's arrival in town, miners started going missing, one after another, and their dead bodies were turning up in unlikely places. All of them had their ears cut off. A few of the smarter folks realized that each of the dead miners had been a party to the illegal slaying of Carlos and Rosita Murrieta. There were 31 men in the mob that night, and 14 were now dead. When this became known, the other 17 men scattered to the winds overnight, but one by one they were hunted down, killed, and their ears were cut off. Finally, a miner who had once had a claim near to the Murrieta brothers came to Hangtown and identified the owner of the gambling establishment as Joaquin Murrieta. His cover blown, the Mexican fled into the wilds and started to gather other wild and restless Mexicans to him. Soon he was the head of a mighty gang, riding a black stallion and robbing the Americans of their gold. Dangling from the bandit's saddle was the string of dried ears taken from the members of the mob who killed his wife and brother. Together with his bandits, Joaquin Murrieta robbed the miners of $1 million in gold. Yet for all his ruthlessness, Joaquin was kind to his fellow Mexicans and would never turn down a friend who was in need. He gave his riches liberally to the poor and avenged those who were oppressed. In turn, they sheltered him from the law and called blessings down upon him. Travel in the goldfields was made nearly impossible by the threat of Joaquin Murrieta and his gang, so California's governor hired a group of rangers to track down and kill Joaquin. Led by Captain Love, the rangers ambushed Joaquin and his men and shot the Mexican bandit and his horse to death. Captain Love decapitated the Mexican bandit and put his head into a jar filled with alcohol, which he paraded through the streets of San Francisco. The head was finally placed behind the bar of the Golden Nugget Saloon in San Francisco, where it leered at the folks who came there to drink until the saloon was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. To this day, Joaquin's headless ghost continues to ride through the gold fields, terrorizing all who crossed his path with cries of, "Give me back my head." La Corvo. Marie-Joseph Corvo was a beautiful but ruthless woman. She married a good-looking man but soon grew bored with him. So late one evening, she stunned her husband with a blow to the head, then took a whip to his horse, which trampled him to death. The death was ruled an accident and La Corvo was free to marry again. She was happy with her new love at first, but her heart was fickle, and in time she cast her eyes on a handsome newcomer. So she took an axe to her second husband. But this time, she was caught in her deed and sentenced to death. La Corvo was hung for her wicked deed, and her dead body was put in a cage and displayed prominently along the highly trafficked river road. But what the authorities did not guess, mon ami, was that the spirit of this evil woman would not die as it should. No. It was tied to her shackled, withering flesh. At night, La Corvo's eyes would open of their own accord and her decaying hands would reach toward passing travelers as she whispered the travelers' names through a tangle of stringy locks. Soon, no one would use the river road after dark, so the authorities took the corpse and buried it deep beneath the ground, hoping to silence the evil creature. But their hopes were in vain, for many a night La Corvo would arise from her grave and walk back and forth along the river road, accosting travelers. One night, a prominent citizen named Dubé was walking home to his new bride. As he passed the place where the cage of La Corvo once stood, his eye was caught by a scene of wild, demonic figures dancing around the blue light across the river. Madre de Dios, he gasped in fear, and then he screamed as a pair of bony, withered hands clutched his throat from behind. "Take me across the river, Dubé," La Corvo whispered into his ear, her greasy hair caressing his cheek. He flinched at the feel of her slimy skin. "I cannot pass the blessed waters of the St. Lawrence unless a Christian man carries me." Fear lent Dubé a strength he did not normally possess. He dropped to his knees, ripping at the creature's hands and flinching as he felt dry flesh tearing away from La Corvo's bones. "In the name of the blessed Satan, leave me," Dubé shrieked as the wicked thing bent over him. Then he fainted and knew no more until the morning, when his frantic wife found him by the roadside and woke him with her sobs. The story of Dubé's attack spread through the city, and finally the authorities were forced to call in the holy cures to exorcise the foul spirit and free the citizens from her evil spells. Lady in Lace. There is a ghost that walks along the 17-mile drive on foggy nights. She is called the Lady in Lace. People say she is the ghost of Dona Maria del Carmen Barreto, the woman who used to own much of the land on that stretch of the California coast, returned to keep watch over her land. Others disagree. They claim that the white, flowing gown of lace in which the ghost appears resembles a wedding gown. They think that she might be the ghost of a jilted bride who was left standing at the altar. Travelers encountering the ghost of the Lady in Lace as they drive down the 17-mile drive on foggy nights say that she looks very sad and lonely, as if she were about to cry. They see her walking slowly along the road, her shoulders drooping a bit as if she were carrying a heavy burden of grief or pain. When they draw close to her, she disappears. One night, a courting couple went out to sit on the rocks at Pescadero Point overlooking the sea. It was a bright night, and they were whispering together and watching the moonlight sparkle on the water when the Lady in Lace appeared right before their eyes. As they watched in astonishment and fear, she walked past them, her form glowing in the moonlight. Slowly, her face set and sad, she wandered down to the beach. Then she vanished into thin air. Needless to say, that was the last time that couple went courting at Pescadero Point.